In a world built for the right hand, the left hand should have faded away long ago. It has been mistrusted, corrected, even forced into hiding for centuries, and yet, somehow, left-handed people are still here, generation after generation, as if human history itself could never quite erase them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of quiet history and mystery you enjoy. The hand reaches out before the mind has time to explain itself. A child leans across a rough wooden table, past a cup, past a scrap of cloth, past the steady arrangement of objects placed by parents, teachers, toolmakers, and generations of other right-handed people who never mean any harm by it. The left hand goes first. It curls around the spoon, the knife, the charcoal, the reed pen. It pushes the wrong way on a latch. It bumps against the elbow of the person beside it. It smears wet ink from left to right across a page designed for the opposite movement. It finds, in 1,000 small ways, that the world has already chosen a favourite side. And yet the left hand remains. It remains in schoolrooms where children once had their knuckles struck for using it. It remains in monasteries, in workshops, in fields, in courts, in factories, in kitchens, in armies, in laboratories, in modern offices full of scissors, desks, and touchpads still quietly biased toward the majority. It remains after sermons, after proverbs, after superstition, after correction, after embarrassment, after all the countless little adjustments by which human societies press bodies into habits that seem normal only because they are common. About 1 person in 10 still prefers the left hand. Not half, not a vanishing rarity, not a trait crushed into extinction, just a stubborn minority, present in every century that can be measured clearly enough, and probably in every century before measurement began. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At first glance, handedness seems too ordinary to deserve much mystery. It hides in plain sight. People notice it most when it causes inconvenience, when a wrist hooks oddly around a line of writing, when a can opener turns the wrong way, when a school desk has its armrest on the wrong side, when a ceremonial gesture or military drill assumes one universal body and leaves the left-handed person to improvise. But what appears trivial on the surface opens into something older and stranger the longer it is observed. Why should most human beings favour the right hand so strongly at all? Why should a persistent minority favour the left? And why? After so many centuries of living in a world arranged against them, have left-handed people not simply disappeared? The question reaches further than etiquette or convenience. It touches the architecture of the brain, the inheritance of traits across families, the survival of variation inside a species that depends on cooperation, and the uneasy history of how cultures decide that a natural difference is somehow suspect. A right-handed world does not arise because someone planned it. It forms gradually, almost invisibly, from majority behaviour. Most people grasp, throw, cut, point, write, and defend themselves with the right hand. So tools are shaped for that grip, workspaces for that reach, rituals for that gesture, even language for that expectation. Once built, the world begins to teach its own assumptions. The child who uses the right hand is seen as correct because the furniture agrees. The child who uses the left seems awkward because the room itself resists. That resistance has ancient roots, though it rarely announces them. A right-handed potter spins, lifts, and smooths clay in ways that become standard technique. A right-handed scribe arranges light, page, and hand position to keep words clear. A right-handed soldier trains to draw and strike from one side of the body. A right-handed carpenter positions tools where the dominant grip finds them fastest. None of this requires hatred of the left hand. The majority simply leaves its imprint on the world, and the world hardens around it. Over time, what began as statistical preference starts to feel like moral order. That is where the story darkens. Across many cultures, the left side gathers an odd burden of meaning, not always, and not everywhere in the same form, but often enough to leave deep marks in language and custom. The right becomes associated with skill, correctness, oath-taking, authority, blessing. The left drifts toward unease, clumsiness, impurity, or bad luck. The evidence is uneven, and scholars still debate how universal these symbolic patterns truly are. But the broad tendency is difficult to miss. Words for the left side in several languages acquire an air of suspicion. Social expectations gather around which hand should offer food, greeting, or allegiance. Later, these symbolic preferences slide into discipline. Children are corrected, adults are judged. A bodily tendency becomes a small social offence. Even in the modern world, where such ideas have weakened, the older pressure has not fully vanished. Many people alive today can still remember classrooms in which left-handed writing was discouraged or forcibly retrained. Some remember grandparents speaking of the left hand in lowered voices as if it marked stubbornness, defiance, or something faintly shameful. Others know only the softened remnants of that older world, the joke gift of a left-handed mug, the awkward desk in a lecture hall, the kitchen drawer filled with utensils that work well for everyone else. Prejudice has become inconvenience in many places, but inconvenience itself tells a long story. It is the fossil of a once harsher judgment. Still, none of that explains survival. Social pressure can alter behaviour. It can even conceal a trait for a time. A left-handed child may learn to write with the right hand. A craftsman may switch for a specific task. A conscript may be drilled into conformity. But preference does not always vanish just because expression is punished. Underneath correction, something persists. The body reaches the way it wants to reach when speed matters, when danger appears suddenly. When there is no time to perform obedience, a stone falls and one hand snaps out first, a branch whips back and one arm rises to shield the face, a baby grabs, a hunter throws, a boxer slips and counters, and the old pattern returns. That stubborn return is one of the reasons handedness matters. It suggests that this is not merely a matter of habit copied from other people. Culture shapes it, yes, and sometimes distorts what can be observed. But culture does not create the phenomenon from nothing. Something deeper is involved. Something tied to the way the human nervous system develops and divides labour between the two halves of the body. The hands are mirrors in bone, but they are not mirrors in use. One tends to lead. One tends to steady. One handles precision, the other support. Even among right-handed people, this arrangement is more complicated than it first appears. And among left-handed people, it grows stranger still. No single explanation fully accounts for it. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the pattern is too old, too widespread, and too stubborn to dismiss as accident. There is also the matter of numbers. Left-handedness is not common enough to dominate, but not rare enough to fade into noise. That narrow middle ground may be the most intriguing part of the whole puzzle. Traits that are purely harmful tend to be reduced over long stretches of time. Traits that are broadly beneficial often become more common. Left-handedness sits in neither place. It carries costs. It has brought social penalties, practical risks. and in some studies correlations with certain difficulties, though these findings require caution and are often overstated in popular discussion. Yet it also endures with remarkable consistency. What survives in the record suggests that human populations repeatedly return to the same rough balance, most right-handed, a few left-handed, never none. That balance turns a simple preference into a historical mystery. It means the left hand is not just an error in the pattern, but part of the pattern itself. Human beings, for reasons not yet fully settled, seem to generate a world in which one side is dominant and the other survives anyway. The majority builds the tools, writes the rules, names the gestures, and hands down its habits until they seem as natural as weather. The minority adapts, absorbs pressure, invents workarounds, and passes on its own quiet continuity. Through all of history, the two facts remain together: the world leans right, and the left hand never leaves. To understand why, it is not enough to stare at modern inconveniences or old superstitions in isolation. The answer, if there is one answer at all, lies somewhere between deep prehistory and modern neuroscience, between bone wear and family inheritance, between social fear and evolutionary logic. It lies in the long human habit of turning difference into symbol, and in the equally long biological habit of preserving variation, even when societies mistrust it. Somewhere in that tension, the left hand survives its bad reputation. Somewhere in that tension, a trait that should, by simple expectation, have been corrected away instead walks beside our species from the beginning. So the story begins not in a classroom, though classrooms play their part, and not in a dictionary full of suspicious words, though language will matter too. It begins much earlier, in bodies before history, in muscle and bone before writing, in the first repeated choices of one hand over another. Long before desks, pens, and formal rules, human beings were already reaching to one side more often than the other. The right-handed world is old. The left hand is older still. Long before anyone wrote laws about proper conduct. Long before priests attached moral weight to one side of the body. Long before schoolmasters tried to train inconvenient children out of their instincts. The evidence was already settling into human remains like a quiet confession. Bone keeps habits. Teeth keep them too. Stone tools, in their own way. Keep them best of all, deep in prehistory, where names vanish and voices leave no trace. The body still records what the hand prefers to do. A skeleton does not announce handedness as clearly as a signature on a page, but it can hint at repeated asymmetry. When one arm performs more forceful or more precise tasks over many years, the bones and joints may develop slightly different patterns of robustness, muscle attachment, or wear. Anthropologists have long searched for these uneven marks in ancient human remains, and sometimes in the remains of close human relatives as well. The results are rarely simple. Bodies live hard lives. One person throws spears, another grinds grain, another climbs, hauls, paddles, or carries children. Injury can reshape a limb. Habit can change across age. Scholars still debate how confidently specific skeletal differences can be tied to handedness rather than to the countless other demands placed on a body. The evidence remains incomplete. Even so, across enough individuals and enough sites, a pattern emerges that is difficult to dismiss. Human asymmetry is ancient, and the preference for one side over the other did not arrive with modern civilization. Teeth offer one of the strangest clues. Early humans often used the mouth as a third hand, gripping hide, sinew, plant fibers, or strips of meat between the teeth while cutting with a stone blade. When the tool passes repeatedly across the material held at the mouth, it can leave tiny scratches on the front teeth. Those scratches are not random. Their angle can suggest whether the blade was drawn by the right hand or the left while the mouth steadied the work. It is an intimate trace, almost absurdly small compared with the scale of human history, yet it can outlast empires. A face long reduced to bone still carries, in microscopic lines, the direction of a wrist. This kind of evidence has been found not only in anatomically modern humans but in older populations too. Some Neanderthal remains show scratch patterns consistent with a strong preference for the right hand. That matters because it pushes asymmetry back beyond cities, beyond agriculture, beyond written language, into a world of hunting, hide processing, firelight, and shifting Ice Age landscapes. The right hand, it seems, had already become the majority hand tens of thousands of years before the first classroom or courtroom existed. But if right-handedness is so old, the obvious question rises immediately behind it. Where, then, was the left hand? Was it already present as a minority, hidden inside the same ancient populations, or did that proportion shift over time in ways we can no longer measure clearly? The record is too fragmentary to answer with perfect confidence. Prehistoric evidence rarely gives neat percentages. A burial ground may preserve only a small group. A cave site may represent a narrow slice of one season, one family cluster, one repeated activity. Bias enters at every stage. Bones break. Context is lost. Interpretation changes with new methods. Yet the broad conclusion survives these uncertainties' lateral preference. The tendency to rely more heavily on one side of the body is not a recent cultural artifact. It belongs to deep human history. What later societies judged, corrected, or mythologized was not a new oddity, but an old feature of the species. Stone tools deepen that story. Tools are among the clearest surviving records of ancient action, because they preserve not only the objects themselves but the logic of the hand that made and used them. A flake struck from a prepared stone core has an angle, a direction, a rhythm of removal. A scraper shaped for gripping settles more comfortably in one hand than another. A spear point or cutting edge can reveal how force was applied and from which side the tool was most likely controlled. Experimental archaeologists have spent years reproducing ancient techniques, trying to understand what sequences of movement leave what signatures in the finished stone. Their results do not turn every artifact into a clean declaration of handedness, but they show that manufacture is often deeply tied to body asymmetry. Toolmaking is choreography. The stone remembers the dance. Then there are the walls of caves, where the evidence becomes almost eerily immediate. In some prehistoric sites, the outlines of hands appear in pigment, not as decorative accidents, but as deliberate signs. A hand is pressed to the rock, and pigment is blown or spattered around it, leaving a negative image. Many of these stenciled hands are left hands. This does not mean those painters were left-handed. In fact, many scholars interpret the pattern the other way around. The artist places the left hand against the wall and uses the right hand to spray pigment. Even so, the image is powerful. The left hand appears on the wall because the right hand is doing the work. The majority pattern may be visible there already, frozen in ochre and breath. Yet here too the conclusion must remain cautious. Not every hand stencil proves the same motion. Not every cave follows the same convention. No single explanation fully accounts for all such images. But the cumulative suggestion is striking. The unequal use of the two hands is woven into the earliest visual traces humans leave behind. This matters because it changes the scale of the mystery. Left-handedness is not interesting merely because modern society treats it as inconvenient. It is interesting because the unequal distribution of handedness seems to have accompanied the species for a very long time. If the right hand became dominant only recently, then perhaps the left hand could be explained as a remnant of some earlier, more balanced state. But the deeper the asymmetry goes, the less convincing that simple story becomes. Human beings appear to have been a mostly right-handed species for so long that the minority status of the left hand is itself ancient. The imbalance is not a cultural whim resting on a biologically neutral base. It looks more like a durable biological tendency, later interpreted and exaggerated by culture. And culture, once it arrives in clearer form, often makes those old asymmetries more rigid. A foraging band can accommodate variation more flexibly than a literate bureaucracy. A hunter can shift position. A flint knapper can learn a workaround. A family can notice that one child throws differently and simply accept it. But as societies grow more structured, more ceremonial, more dependent on standard tools, repeated writing systems, synchronized labor, and formal instruction, the room for bodily difference narrows. The left-handed minority, already small, becomes more visible because systems are now built with less tolerance for deviation. In that sense, archaeology reveals something important before history itself begins to speak. The problem is not that left-handedness suddenly appears and alarms civilization. The problem is that civilization magnifies a pre-existing difference and then starts telling stories about what it means. That older prehistorical world may have noticed handedness without loading it with the same moral weight. This remains hard to prove. Prehistoric societies leave no direct commentary on whether a left-handed hunter was seen as strange, useful, unlucky, or unremarkable. What survives in the record suggests variation, not uniform judgment. A body differs, a task is done, a tool is worn, a handprint remains. Interpretation begins much later, when literate societies start surrounding the body with words. Before that, asymmetry may simply have been part of the practical grammar of survival. One person scrapes hide this way, another throws from that shoulder, another carries with one arm stronger than the other. Difference exists, but it has not yet been pulled into a moral theatre. Even so, prehistory gives one more reason to take the puzzle seriously. Human survival in harsh environments depends on efficiency. Traits that seriously hinder survival over many generations often shrink or disappear unless they are tied to some compensating advantage or are continually reintroduced by complex inheritance. If handedness has deep roots, and if left-handedness has likely persisted within that broader pattern for most of those roots, then it has already survived enormous tests. Climate swings, migrations, famine, injury, conflict, infancy in dangerous landscapes, adulthood in tool-dependent societies. It has survived not only modern inconvenience but Ice Age reality. That does not prove left-handedness is advantageous in itself. It does suggest that it is not simply a fatal defect waiting to be filtered out. There is, in other words, a strange durability here. Human beings spread across continents, adapted to coasts, forests, rivers, tundra, deserts, and mountain corridors, developed new tools, new food strategies, new social bonds, new dangers, and still the species retained its asymmetry. The right hand remained the majority hand. The left remained the exception. Prehistory does not tell us exactly why. It does something more important. It tells us the question is old enough to matter. In the silence before recorded history, the evidence is never generous. It comes in fragments, a stronger humorous, a line of wear, a cut mark, a scatter of flakes, a set of scratches crossing ancient teeth at an angle no one living ever intended to preserve. But taken together, these fragments say something clear. Human beings have long been uneven creatures. One side leads, one side follows. Most people lean right, some do not. And far back in the caves and campsites of the ancient world, before prejudice gave the difference a name, the body was already making its choice. Inside the skull, the symmetry begins to fail almost at once. The two hemispheres look like twins at a glance, folded in the same pale matter, facing each other across a narrow divide. But they do not behave as equals. One tends to specialize in certain tasks, the other in others. Language often settles more heavily on the left side of the brain. Spatial processing, attention, emotional tone, and broad pattern recognition often lean, in different ways, toward the right. The arrangement is never as neat as older diagrams once suggested, and modern neuroscience has spent years correcting simplistic maps of left brain logic and right brain creativity. Still, the central fact remains. Human brains are lateralized. They divide labor unevenly, and from that unevenness, somewhere in the crowded traffic between intention and movement, handedness emerges. That does not mean the brain contains a single switch labeled right or left. If it did, the mystery would have been settled long ago. Instead, handedness appears to grow out of several overlapping systems: motor control, language organization, sensory integration, timing, development before birth, and the long process by which an infant becomes a coordinated body in the world. By the time a child reaches for a spoon with one hand more often than the other, a deep set of developmental patterns is already at work. Some begin before birth. Fetuses have been observed sucking one thumb more often than the other, turning the head preferentially, moving one arm with slightly different frequency or control. These earlier symmetries do not predict everything, but they suggest that handedness is not merely taught by parents after the fact. The body begins leaning before culture has much chance to intervene. Even so, culture later shapes what can be seen. A child with a mild left preference may be nudged toward the right by imitation, instruction, or simple convenience. Another with a stronger preference may resist correction and remain clearly left-handed. Between those two extremes lies a wide territory of mixed habits, task-specific choices, and changing expression. That is one reason why handedness is harder to define than it first appears. Some people write with the left hand and throw with the right. Some switch depending on the tool. Some were retrained early and report a lingering sense that one side still feels more natural under pressure. Researchers who study handedness therefore have to make choices about measurement. Do they care about writing hand, throwing hand, tool use, self-reported preference, or consistent dominance across many tasks? Different studies answer differently, and the variation complicates every attempt to draw simple conclusions. Still, the broad distribution is unmistakable. Most human beings favor the right hand strongly enough that it cannot be explained as random habit. This majority pattern appears closely linked to the way the brain organizes movement and, in many cases, language. For most right-handed people, language functions are concentrated more heavily in the left hemisphere, which also controls the right side of the body. That rough association led earlier researchers to imagine a tidy rule: left hemisphere for language, right hand for action, left-handedness as a kind of reversal. Reality is less obedient. Many left-handed people also show left hemisphere language dominance. Others show more bilateral distribution, with language shared more evenly across both hemispheres, or a stronger contribution from the right side. Scholars still debate exactly how these patterns connect. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for why one person becomes left-handed while another, with a surprisingly similar brain organization on paper, does not. This uncertainty matters because handedness sits at the meeting point between deep biological tendency and messy individual development. Genes play a role, but not a commanding one. Environment matters, but not in the obvious sense of parents deciding by force. Developmental noise matters too. Slight differences in how tissues grow, how neural pathways strengthen, how prenatal conditions influence the fetus, how early movement becomes preference through repetition. The result is less like a blueprint and more like a bias in a complex system. The species leans right, strongly and consistently, but not absolutely. A certain portion of individuals develop otherwise, and that minority is large enough to be stable and visible. Some of the most intriguing clues come from the brain's own anatomy. Subtle asymmetries exist in structures associated with language and motor planning. Certain grooves and regions may differ on average between hemispheres in ways that correlate loosely with function. Yet these correlations are statistical, not destinies. A brain scan does not read like a prophecy. It offers tendencies, probabilities, overlapping maps. Two people can share similar structural asymmetries and differ in handedness. Two left-handed people can show different patterns of language lateralization. Human variation refuses to stay tidy. That refusal is part of the reason handedness continues to fascinate scientists. It sits close enough to brain specialization to seem explainable, yet far enough from simple rules to resist neat theories. There is also a deeper evolutionary implication. Large brains are expensive organs. They consume energy, demand a long developmental period, and require fine coordination between perception, memory, planning, and movement. If the human brain evolved to distribute labor across hemispheres, that division may have improved efficiency. Lateralization can reduce redundancy, streamline processing, and allow two sides of the brain to contribute differently rather than duplicating each other. In that sense, the very existence of handedness may be a side effect of a more general strategy, the uneven organization of a highly complex brain. The species does not merely happen to prefer one hand. It may prefer one hand because the brain itself is built to specialize. And yet specialization creates the minority as well as the majority. Once a system evolves that leans in one direction, variation within that system can produce a smaller group that leans another way. The minority may not represent error so much as tolerated difference within a biased design. That possibility becomes even more plausible when one looks beyond humans. Lateralized behavior appears in many animals. Birds may favor one eye for certain tasks. Fish may turn preferentially in one direction. Primates show side preferences in reaching or grooming, though often less strongly population-wide than humans. The living world is full of creatures whose nervous systems are not perfectly symmetrical in use. Human-handedness is unusual in degree and social consequence, but not wholly alone in principle. The social consequence, of course, changes everything. A crow with a turning preference is not handed a pen and judged for its grip. A fish is not told it is impolite to approach from one side. Humans build institutions around bodily norms, and once those norms harden, a natural statistical tendency begins to resemble a rule. The right-handed majority, grounded in brain lateralization, becomes the template for education, work, design, and ritual, left-handedness. Born from the same general architecture of asymmetrical brains, is then treated as if it were an intrusion rather than an expected minority outcome of the species' own design. It is biology first, then culture on top of biology, then stigma on top of culture. One surprising detail in all this is how often left-handedness has been linked, in both serious research and popular imagination, to creativity, disorder, genius, awkwardness, sensitivity, or instability. Most such claims are exaggerated. Some are built on weak samples, publication bias, or the public appetite for romantic exceptions. The evidence for sweeping psychological differences between left and right-handed people is far less dramatic than many headlines suggest. But the persistence of these claims reveals something important. Once handedness is connected to the brain, people begin to treat it as a key to the whole person. They want it to explain temperament, intelligence, artistry, even destiny. The science does not support most of these leaps. What survives in the record suggests something more restrained and more interesting. Handedness is one visible sign of a brain that develops asymmetrically, not a magical code that unlocks character. That restraint matters because the real story is already strange enough. A creature with two seemingly matched hands builds a nervous system that quietly favors one side. That preference emerges before birth, grows through development, links imperfectly to language and motor organization, and settles into a pattern that is both ancient and remarkably stable. Most people become right-handed, some do not. The difference is not invented by custom, though custom later disciplines it. It is not determined by a single gene, though inheritance matters. It is not a clean reversal of brain function, though lateralization is central. Every simple explanation breaks down at the edges. And perhaps that is the clearest clue of all. Handedness belongs to one of those human categories that seem simple only from a distance. Up close, it dissolves into gradients, mixed patterns, developmental pathways, and competing models. The right hand dominates because the species is built with an uneven brain. The left hand persists because uneven systems do not produce identical bodies. Somewhere in that imbalance, somewhere between embryonic movement and adult habit, the body chooses a side and then spends a lifetime learning what that choice will cost. Before the left hand became a problem, it was almost certainly just a fact. That is the difficult thing to recover from the deep past. Later civilizations leave so much commentary, so many anxieties, so many rules about purity, order, skill, and the proper use of the body, that it becomes easy to imagine those attitudes stretching unchanged all the way back to the beginning. But prehistory is not later history in simpler clothing. Early human communities lived close to necessity. Their lives were organized around movement, weather, animals, fire, kinship, injury, memory, and the constant need to do difficult things with whatever bodies they had. In such a world, difference would have been noticed, certainly, but notice is not the same as condemnation. A person who threw with the left hand, cut hide from an unusual angle, or cradled a spear shaft on the opposite side might have stood out only in the most practical sense. They did not fit the majority pattern. That did not automatically make them suspect. The evidence for how early communities felt about left-handedness is, unavoidably, indirect. There are no surviving speeches from hunter-gatherers explaining whether a child's hand preference was celebrated, ignored, or frowned upon. There are no formal codes from Upper Paleolithic camps detailing the acceptable grip for a scraper or a spear. What survives in the record suggests bodily variation existed long before institutional judgment. It also suggests that the burden of symbolism attached to the left side grew heavier, In more stratified and ritualized societies, where social order had stronger reasons to classify, rank, and discipline the body, that means the earliest human groups may have been less interested in moralizing handedness than later states. Temples and schools would become. One reason is simple necessity. Small communities cannot afford to waste useful people over trivial deviations. In a foraging world, survival depends on competence more than conformity. A person who can butcher cleanly, track carefully, repair a shelter, remember a route, tend a wound, or calm a frightened child is valuable, whether they reach first with the right hand or the left. In fact, some variation might even have practical advantages in shared tasks. Two people standing side by side, working from opposite dominant hands, may interfere with each other less in certain positions. A fighter approaching from the less expected angle may be harder to read. A craftsperson who handles objects differently may discover alternative techniques without intending to. These are modest possibilities, not romantic certainties, and scholars still debate how much everyday advantage handedness could provide in small prehistoric communities. But they make one thing easier to imagine. Difference need not begin as deficiency. The body in early societies was also observed more intimately than in later urban life. People lived close to one another, knew each other's habits across seasons and years, and saw skill emerge gradually. A left-handed child would not arrive as an abstract category. They would arrive as this child, with this gait, this laugh, this awkwardness, this talent for knotting cord or shaping points, or hitting a target on the run. The preference of one hand over the other would be embedded in personality and usefulness, not stripped out and judged as a detached trait. Later societies, especially bureaucratic ones, prefer categories because categories are easy to regulate. Earlier communities may have dealt more readily in persons. That does not mean prehistoric life was gentle or endlessly tolerant. Small communities can be conservative. They can enforce custom sharply. They can attach meaning to unusual bodies or unexpected behavior. Humans are symbol-making creatures long before writing begins. A difference may draw attention precisely because it is rare. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be naive to imagine some lost age in which every variation passed without comment. But there is a difference between remarking on rarity and constructing a durable cultural suspicion around it. The first may be ancient. The second appears, as far as the record can show, more strongly associated with complex symbolic systems that divide the world into auspicious and inauspicious, clean and unclean, proper and improper. There is another reason to be cautious about projecting later prejudice backward. Many of the meanings attached to left and right depend on settled patterns of ritual action. Which hand presents food? Which hand takes an oath? Which side is associated with honor? Which direction begins a formal procession? Which side of the body is emphasized in law, greeting, sacrifice, writing, or inheritance? These distinctions intensify when societies become more structured and repetitive, when actions must be performed the same way across many people and over long spans of time. In a mobile or loosely organized community, practical adaptation matters more than ceremonial precision. One can imagine handedness becoming more culturally visible as human life itself becomes more formalized. Writing may have amplified that visibility dramatically, not yet in the earliest periods, but eventually. Scripts that move in one direction reward one posture and punish another. Wet ink, brush angle, pen pressure, hand position, and page layout all make the writer's body newly legible. A person whose hand moves against the grain of the script does not merely differ, they leave visible evidence of differing: smudges, hooked wrists, cramped posture, altered stroke order, all invite correction. In oral societies, bodily variation may remain woven into action. In literate societies, it becomes inspectable. The moment a child's hand begins to leave marks on a public surface, conformity acquires a stronger motive. Before that, however, left-handedness may have sat closer to other forms of human unevenness that people simply accommodated. One hunter sees better at distance. One runner favours one knee. One elder cannot squat but remembers every water source for 2 days' travel. One child learns by watching. Another learns by doing. One hand leads. One steadies. Such differences matter, but they do not yet belong to a moral hierarchy. They are part of the practical landscape of group life. Bodies differ, and communities survive by finding uses for the bodies they have. There may even have been contexts in which the unusualness of left-handed action gave it a subtle aura of distinction rather than disgrace. This is harder to prove and should be treated carefully. Rare traits often attract attention, and attention can cut in different directions. Something uncommon may be seen as awkward, but it may also be seen as memorable, uncanny, or specially fitted to particular roles. The surviving evidence is too thin to make strong claims here. No single explanation fully accounts for how early societies responded to bodily rarity. Still, anthropology offers a broad warning against assuming that every visible deviation from the majority immediately becomes taboo. Human cultures are inventive. They attach meanings in many directions. The later burden placed on the left side may therefore tell us more about the societies doing the judging than about the trait itself. Once hierarchy grows, once ritual order deepens, once writing, law, and ceremony spread through daily life, the body becomes a site of discipline. It must present itself correctly, move correctly, hold things correctly, approach others correctly. The hand is no longer just a hand. It becomes a sign of alignment with the rules. Under such conditions, the minority body becomes conspicuous not because it is biologically stranger than before, but because the social world has become less patient with divergence. That shift helps explain a puzzle that would otherwise seem contradictory. If left-handedness were truly intolerable to human communities at every stage, one might expect stronger evidence of its disappearance or more drastic biological reduction over time. But what survives in the record suggests continuity, not eradication. The trait persists. That persistence fits more comfortably with a long history in which left-handedness was often manageable, sometimes remarked upon, and only later turned into a sharper object of symbolic discomfort. Culture did not create the minority. It gradually made the minority harder to ignore. In that older world, before language on tablets and penalties in classrooms, there was probably no single story told about the child who reached left first. Some communities may have shrugged, some may have adapted tools informally, some may have noticed and said nothing. Others may have woven the difference into local beliefs now lost beyond recovery. Scholars still debate how much can safely be inferred here, because prehistory offers signs without commentary. Yet the absence of overt condemnation in the earliest evidence is itself suggestive. For a very long time, the left hand may simply have existed in the same quiet way that all minority traits exist before institutions decide to notice them too much. And perhaps that is the most human part of the story. A difference begins as a variation of the body. It becomes a curiosity, then a pattern, then a symbol, then a problem. The farther back one goes, the harder it is to find the problem, and the easier it is to see only the body itself, reaching whichever way it naturally reaches. Before there was stigma, there was a symmetry. Before there was superstition, there was habit. Before the left hand became morally loaded, it was only a hand, doing what it had always done, in a world still too practical to be offended by it. Once the left hand enters the world of symbols, it stops being merely unusual and starts becoming dangerous in ways that have very little to do with muscle, bone, or practical ability. This is one of the oldest habits of civilization. A bodily difference appears. Language notices it. Ritual arranges itself around it. Law repeats the arrangement. Everyday custom absorbs the lesson until it feels ancient and obvious. What began as a minority pattern of movement becomes, over time, a sign loaded with meanings it never asked to carry. The right side, in many cultures, gathers prestige almost effortlessly. It becomes the side of oath-taking, greeting, blessing, gifting, formal action, rightful authority. The reasons vary. Most people are right-handed, so the right hand is usually the stronger, steadier, more skillful hand in daily life. The hand that grips best also becomes the hand trusted for public acts. That practical preference then drifts into symbolism. Strength becomes correctness. Familiarity becomes virtue. Coordination becomes moral approval. On the other side, the left begins to collect what the right leaves behind: awkwardness, uncertainty, inversion, impropriety, bad timing, bad luck. Language preserves these judgments with surprising persistence. In several linguistic traditions, words associated with the left side develop negative overtones, while words connected to the right side lean toward ideas of correctness, skill, lawfulness, or favor. This pattern is not universal in every language or every historical moment, and scholars still debate how much weight should be placed on etymology alone. Words can drift unpredictably. Meanings split and reconnect. Yet the broad tendency appears often enough to matter. Human beings repeatedly take a physical asymmetry and turn it into a verbal one. The body leans right, and language begins to praise the rightness of the right. Religious and ritual systems deepen the divide. In structured ceremonies, it matters which hand presents an offering, which hand receives sacred food, which side of the body is considered appropriate for contact, cleansing, greeting, or public display. These rules are never only about handedness, of course. They belong to larger systems of purity, hierarchy, and controlled movement. But handedness becomes entangled with them, because the hand is where bodily preference becomes most visible. A right-handed majority codifies its own comfort, and once ritual grants that comfort a sacred or moral force, deviation becomes more than inconvenient. It becomes improper. This process can happen without any conscious conspiracy. No council needs to gather and decide to stigmatize the left. 1,000 smaller habits do the work. Most people pass objects with one hand, so that becomes the normal hand for passing. Most people make a sign or salute with one side, so that becomes the respectful side. Most people draw a blade or tool from one direction, so that direction becomes standard in drill, craft, and etiquette. Over generations, the standard hardens. What is statistically common begins to feel cosmically ordained. The minority body now appears not merely different, but contrary. The left side also acquires symbolic weight through a more general human tendency to divide the world into pairs light and dark, pure and impure, upper and lower, male and female, order and disorder, life and death, east and west, inside and outside. Civilizations are fond of binary thinking because it makes the world legible. Once such paired systems are in place, left and right become available as another moral map. One side stands for control, stability, legitimacy. The other becomes the place where ambiguity gathers. No single explanation fully accounts for why the left so often ends up carrying the darker burden, but the simplest answer may still be the strongest. The majority hand became the trusted hand, and trust expanded from use into myth. Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions offer several examples of this broad tendency, though they do not form one uniform block. Roman culture, for instance, carried a complicated symbolic vocabulary around left and right, especially in ritual and divination. The meanings could shift depending on context, orientation, and tradition, which is a reminder that symbolism is rarely as tidy as later summaries suggest. Even so, the association of the left with unease, reversal, or ill omen remained powerful enough to leave a long cultural shadow. Later European languages would inherit parts of that shadow and deepen it further. The left hand became not just uncommon, but faintly ominous. Other societies built comparable distinctions through different logics. In some traditions, one hand becomes associated with clean or honourable action, while the other is assigned to tasks considered unclean or socially inferior. This distinction is not purely about left-handedness, since right-handed majorities often train themselves to use the left for specific bodily functions regardless of dominance. But it reinforces the cultural degradation of the left side as a whole. A left-handed child raised in such a setting does not merely prefer the minority hand. They may find that their natural dominant hand has already been culturally designated for lesser or prohibited use. The result is not only inconvenience but deep embodied confusion. Once social meaning reaches that level, correction becomes almost inevitable. Parents intervene not because they have studied neurology, but because they want the child to move properly through the world. Priests and teachers correct because propriety has become visible in gesture. Officials correct because order depends on standardization. The child experiences all this not as a philosophical argument, but as repeated friction. Use the other hand, sit this way, hold it like this. Do not offer with that hand. Do not write from that side. The social world keeps pressing the same lesson. The wrong hand is not wrong because it fails. It is wrong because it violates expectation. This is where symbolism begins to damage lives. A practical inconvenience can be solved with adaptation. A symbolic stigma is harder to escape because it follows the person into identity. The left-handed individual may come to feel not merely awkward but suspect, clumsy by nature, morally out of line, or destined for correction. The historical record preserves many traces of these attitudes in jokes, insults, instructional practices, and moral sayings. Some are mild, others are harsh. Together they form a long education in bodily self-doubt. Yet the historical picture should remain careful. Not every civilization condemned the left hand in identical ways, and not every symbolic distinction translated into cruelty. In some times and places, the stigma may have been strong and explicit. In others, it may have remained a softer preference, more etiquette than persecution. Scholars still debate the exact degree of hostility in many contexts, especially where sources are sparse or filtered through elite writing. What survives in the record often reflects priests, administrators, moralists, and literate classes more than ordinary daily tolerance. Even so, the pattern is too widespread to ignore. Across centuries and across very different societies, the left repeatedly becomes the side that needs explanation. That repetition matters because it shows how easily human beings naturalize their own majority. A right-handed world is not content merely to be right-handed. It often wants to believe that right-handedness is inherently better, cleaner, safer, or more proper. The leap from common to correct is one of the oldest errors in social history. It appears in judgments about bodies, languages, customs, genders, classes, and beliefs. Handedness is a small but revealing example. The body presents a harmless minority variation, and culture answers by wrapping that variation in suspicion until people forget the suspicion was invented. By the time these meanings settle into proverb and custom, they become hard to see as historical constructions at all. They seem like common sense. A child learns them without being formally taught. A gesture feels rude because everyone reacts as if it is rude. A hand feels wrong because a room full of right-handed people built the world around their ease and then named that ease virtue. This is how asymmetry hardens into hierarchy. The right hand is not only dominant, it becomes respectable. And still, even under that burden, the left hand remains. That is the strange continuity running beneath all the symbolism. Civilizations name it, fear it, discipline it, assign it lesser roles, treat it as unlucky, train it away, and yet it continues to appear in each new generation, as if none of the stories told against it were ever fully believed by the body itself. Culture can make the left hand suspect. It cannot stop children from being born to reach with it. The correction often begins with kindness. A parent notices that the child keeps shifting the spoon, the chalk, the needle, the toy knife, the brush, back into the left hand. At first it seems like a small inconvenience, the sort of thing adults believe can be gently smoothed out before it becomes a habit. The object is placed again in the right hand. The left is tapped away from the page. The child is guided, turned, praised when compliant, frowned at when instinct returns. Nothing dramatic is required at first. The world itself seems to support the effort. Desks are made for the right arm. Writing flows in a direction that favours the right hand. Tools sit more naturally in a right-handed grip. Social rules are already waiting in place. Correction can therefore present itself not as punishment, but as preparation. That is what makes it so effective and so hard to resist. The left-handed child is rarely told that their body is hated. More often, they are taught that their body is inconvenient, and that convenience is reason enough to change. Adults may believe they are helping. In many cases, they sincerely are trying to spare the child embarrassment, difficulty, or social judgment. The correction comes wrapped in practicality. Use the other hand and life will go more smoothly. Use the other hand and your writing will look cleaner. Use the other hand and the teacher will stop complaining. Use the other hand and people will stop staring. The lesson is not simply that the left hand is wrong. It is that the left hand is expensive. Schoolrooms gave that lesson some of its harshest form. For generations, in many countries, children were trained away from left-handed writing by methods that range from steady pressure to outright humiliation. Hands were tied down, knuckles were rapped, pages were snatched away and rewritten. Teachers stood over desks and repositioned pencils again and again, as if enough repetition could persuade the nervous system to forget its own preferences. Some children complied outwardly and never fully recovered their ease. Others developed a divided method, writing with the right hand while throwing, catching, reaching, or gesturing with the left whenever attention slipped. Still others resisted so stubbornly that correction failed, leaving behind only a memory of daily friction and the feeling that ordinary acts had become moral tests. The cost of such retraining is difficult to measure because it touches parts of life that do not show up neatly in records. Some left-handed adults later described headaches, stammering, confusion, slowed writing, fatigue, or a persistent sense of bodily awkwardness after being forced to switch hands in childhood. Not every such account can be traced confidently to retraining itself. Human development is complicated, and older educators often made exaggerated claims about the dangers of left-handedness, just as later critics sometimes made exaggerated claims about the universal harms of switching. Scholars still debate the strength of specific links. The evidence remains incomplete, but no serious reading of the history leaves much doubt that forced conversion often created unnecessary strain. The child was being asked to overwrite a deep habit with constant conscious control. Even when that succeeded outwardly, it could leave a private residue of effort. That effort mattered all the more in tasks requiring speed and precision. Writing is one obvious example, because it is culturally visible and endlessly corrected. A right-handed script, especially one moving from left to right across the page, favors the hand that trails behind the line rather than pushing into it. A left-handed child writing in such a system often smears fresh ink, blocks the view of the letters being formed, twists the wrist into uncomfortable positions, and receives criticism not just for being different, but for producing visibly different marks. The page becomes a small battlefield where motor preference, script direction, classroom standards, and adult patience collide. A child who naturally wants to move one way is told that the page only accepts the other, but writing was only one front in a much wider campaign of standardization. Workshops trained apprentices in conventional body positions. Domestic tasks were demonstrated from the right. Religious practice assumed particular gestures. Military drill depended on synchronized movement and shared orientation, which left little room for bodily idiosyncrasy. In a formation, the left-handed recruit is not merely unusual. He is disruptive to the symmetry of the whole group. Weapons hang from the expected side. Commands assume the expected arm. Drill becomes one more tool for teaching the minority body to imitate the majority at all costs. This pressure was strongest in institutions because institutions depend on repetition. A family may tolerate a strange grip if the child still eats well enough. A community may shrug at an odd throwing style if the hunter returns with meat. But a school, a monastery, a barracks, a factory floor, a formal craft tradition, these systems prefer standard bodies because standard bodies are easier to teach, supervise, and compare. The left-handed person is troublesome not because they fail, but because they force the system to notice that its rules are narrower than human variation. It is often easier to change the person than the system. Sometimes that change produces strange compromises. A left-handed child might be taught to write with the right hand but allowed to eat with the left at home. A worker might use the standard grip for formal tasks while quietly reverting to the left when tired or unwatched. A soldier might drill one way and fight another under pressure. Such mixed dominance could look, from the outside, like proof that handedness was flexible and therefore trivial. In reality, it often revealed the opposite. The body bent because it had to, not because the preference underneath had disappeared, under stress, speed, or surprise. The old asymmetry frequently re-emerged. There is also a quieter cost to all of this, one less visible than cramped handwriting or clumsy drill. Repeated correction teaches a child to mistrust the first impulse of the body. Reach. No, not that way. Hold. No, the other hand. Throw. Not like that. Greet. Not that side. Offer. Not with that one. Over time, The lesson extends beyond the specific act. The child learns hesitation. Before doing anything visible, they check themselves. In some lives, this becomes merely a faint habit of caution. In others, it deepens into shame. The body is no longer a natural instrument, but a thing requiring supervision. And still, the left hand finds its moments. It returns in play, in speed, in irritation, in private work, in tasks too sudden for self-monitoring. Many adults who are retrained remember that some acts never truly shifted. They still throw left-handed. They still reach with the left when startled. They still trust the left hand for strength or accuracy, even if years of schooling taught them to disguise it in public. This persistence is one of the clearest signs that handedness is not merely an opinion taught by adults. Training can redirect performance. It cannot always dissolve preference. Modern readers sometimes imagine these corrective regimes as relics of distant centuries, but they survived surprisingly late. In some places, forced switching continued well into the 20th century, carried forward by teachers who regarded it as common sense rather than cruelty. The memory is therefore not ancient history for everyone. It lives within families. A grandmother who writes neatly with her right hand but peels fruit with the left. A father who still says he was made right-handed at school. A teacher who no longer strikes children but instinctively nudges a pencil from one hand to the other, because that is how she herself was taught. The prejudice softens, but its habits endure. No single explanation fully accounts for why institutions invested so much effort in changing left-handed children. Partly it was superstition, partly efficiency, partly aesthetics, partly fear of difference, partly the simple inertia of a world designed by the majority and impatient with accommodation. Yet whatever the motive, the result was consistent. The left-handed minority was told, again and again, that survival in society required imitation, and yet imitation never became erasure. That is the deeper story beneath the correction. Schools trained, homes corrected, workshops standardized, armies drilled, pages, tools, desks, and rituals all leaned to the right, but the left hand remained present beneath the training like a river forced underground. Sometimes it surfaced in secret, sometimes in defiance, sometimes only in the smallest acts, too quick to censor and too old to extinguish. A child could be taught to write against instinct. The species itself could not be taught out of producing that instinct again. For all the pressure placed upon it, left-handedness refuses to behave like a mistake. That is the central puzzle now waiting in the middle of the story. If left-handed people have so often faced inconvenience, suspicion, correction, and in some periods outright coercion, why does the trait remain so stable? Why is the world not almost entirely right-handed by now? Social pressure alone does not erase it. That much history has already shown. But what about deeper time, deeper selection, deeper biological filtering? If a trait carries costs, and if those costs have been repeated across generations, then simple reasoning suggests it should either shrink toward near extinction or reveal some compensating benefit. Left-handedness does neither in a straightforward way. It does not vanish. It does not spread. It stays. That stability is one of the strangest facts in all of human variation. Across many populations, the proportion of people who are clearly left-handed hovers at roughly the same low level, usually around 1 in 10, though the exact number shifts depending on how handedness is measured and how much social correction has been present in a given culture or period. The figures are never perfectly clean. Some societies underreport because left-handed children were trained to switch. Some studies count only writing hand, while others examine many tasks. Some people are mixed-handed and slip between categories. Yet even after allowing for all that uncertainty, the broad pattern remains remarkably stubborn. Human beings are not 50-50. They're not 99-1. They're mostly right-handed, with a persistent minority that remains too large to dismiss and too small to dominate. That middle position is what makes handedness different from many other bodily traits. A feature that is strongly beneficial in almost every context often grows more common over long spans of time. A feature that is consistently harmful tends to become rarer unless it is repeatedly reintroduced through mutation or tightly linked to something advantageous. Left-handedness seems to live in between. It may carry disadvantages in daily life simply because most tools, systems, and expectations are built against it. In some settings, it may be associated with slightly elevated risks of certain developmental or health difficulties. Though such findings are often overstated, vary across studies, and should be treated with caution. But even if some of these costs are real, they're not strong enough to eliminate the trait. Something about human biology keeps producing it, and something about human evolution keeps tolerating it. This is why scholars return again and again to the idea that left-handedness may be maintained by balance rather than by simple triumph or failure. Not balance in the sense of equal numbers, but balance in the sense of a trait that remains useful, or at least acceptable, when rare and less useful when common. The left hand may survive not because it wins, but because it occupies a narrow and durable place in the ecology of human variation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the exact numbers. Still, the persistence itself demands explanation. Random developmental noise alone might generate occasional left-handed individuals, but the regularity of the proportion suggests something more structured than accident. One possibility is that the trait persists because the disadvantages are mostly social rather than biological. In that view, left-handedness may not have been costly enough in ancestral environments to face strong negative selection. A left-handed person in a small foraging band might adapt with little trouble. Many of the strongest disadvantages appear in later, more standardized societies' writing systems, industrial tools, formal schooling, mass production, synchronized military drill. If the costs are historically recent and culturally inflated, then evolution may have had little reason to purge the trait before civilization made it conspicuous. This is plausible, but it does not solve everything. Even in simpler environments, asymmetry matters in tool use, coordination, conflict, and learning. If left-handedness were entirely neutral, one might still expect wider fluctuation in its frequency than the record seems to show. Another possibility is that left-handedness is repeatedly generated as a minority outcome of how human development works. The species may be strongly biased toward right-handedness because of brain lateralization, but not so rigidly designed that every individual follows the same path. Development is noisy. Genes interact with prenatal conditions, timing, growth, and countless slight variations in neural organization. The result is a system that mostly produces right-handers while reliably producing some left-handers as well. In this view, the minority persists because the biological architecture of the species more or less guarantees it. That may be part of the truth. Yet the question lingers. Why would such an architecture evolve and remain if the minority outcome brought only disadvantage? Here the puzzle grows sharper. For generations, many researchers have suspected that left-handedness survives because rarity itself can be useful. A trait does not need to be broadly superior in all contexts to remain in a population. It may only need to help under certain conditions, especially when uncommon. This kind of logic appears elsewhere in evolution. Strategies can coexist when each has advantages that depend on how many others are using it. A rare form can prosper because others are not prepared for it. If it becomes too common, the advantage fades. The result is not conquest, but equilibrium. That possibility transforms the mystery. The left hand may remain not in spite of its minority status, but because of it. The very thing that makes left-handers inconvenient in a right-handed world may also be what preserves them. Their movements are less expected. Their angles are less familiar. Their rhythms are harder to read if most people train, fight, catch, block, or anticipate the actions of right-handed opponents. This idea will matter more as the story moves into conflict and competition. But even here, before the fuller argument unfolds, its logic is already visible. In a species where social and physical interactions are constant, being unusual can sometimes be an advantage precisely because others are adapted to the common case. At the same time, it would be too neat to treat left-handedness as a hidden gift waiting to be discovered. History does not support such romantic simplicity. Left-handed people have often paid real costs. The body strains differently in right-handed systems. Tools injure, techniques must be relearned. Correction wounds confidence. Some evidence suggests that mixed or atypical lateralization may, in certain cases, be linked with developmental complications. Though the pattern is complex and easily distorted by poor measurement or by the historical effects of retraining, scholars still debate how much of the burden comes from biology and how much from the social environments built around right-handed norms. What survives in the record suggests both caution and contradiction. Left-handedness is neither a pure liability nor a secret superpower. It is a durable minority trait whose persistence cannot be explained by any single story of harm or benefit. That is why the numbers themselves become so haunting. 1 in 10 is not a random curiosity. It is the shape of a compromise written into the species. A world of almost all right-handers would be simpler to design, easier to standardize, perhaps more efficient in certain collective tasks. A world with many more left-handers would transform those same systems and erase the rarity that may give the minority part of its edge. Instead, humanity seems to settle into an old asymmetry and stay there. As if evolution found a narrow range it could live with and history, for all its attempts at correction, never managed to shift it very far. There is kind of irony in that. Societies often act as if left-handedness is an aberration produced by poor training, bad habits, or refusal to conform. But the numbers say something else. The minority is so persistent, across cultures and centuries, that it looks less like error than design. Not conscious design, but the design of a species whose development is biased without being absolute. The right hand dominates, the left hand endures. Both facts appear to belong to the same underlying arrangement. So the mystery is no longer just why the world is right-handed. That much is bound up with the asymmetrical brain and the dominant pattern of human development. The deeper mystery is why the minority remains so faithful to its share of the population. Why not fewer? Why not more? Why does human variation settle here? Scholars still debate the answer, and the evidence remains incomplete. But by now, one conclusion is hard to avoid. Left-handedness is not a temporary defect awaiting correction by history. It is a stable part of the human story, a minority that refuses both extinction and victory. And that refusal changes the tone of everything that comes after. Once the trait is understood as persistent rather than accidental, the old prejudices begin to look thinner. The left hand is not an error. Civilization has not yet managed to fix. It is something civilization keeps encountering because the species itself keeps making room for it. However crookedly the world is built, however firmly it leans to the right, it never becomes so one-sided that the left hand stops appearing in the cradle, on the hunt, at the workbench, at the writing desk, and in the quick reflex of a person reaching before there is time to remember what society prefers. By the time the question reaches evolution, it has already shed its old moral costume. No omen can answer it, no proverb can solve it. The left hand is no longer being asked to justify itself before teachers or priests, but before the colder logic of persistence. Why does a minority trait remain so steady inside a species shaped by selection? What keeps bringing it back, generation after generation, even when the world appears designed against it? The first thing evolution does is strip away the idea that every trait must be either wholly good or wholly bad. That is not how living systems work. Many traits survive because they are good in some contexts and costly in others. Some remain because they are tied to larger developmental patterns that cannot be simplified without disrupting something else. Some persist because rarity itself has value. Others remain because the costs are not severe enough or not consistent enough for selection to remove them. Left-handedness sits in precisely this uncomfortable territory, where simple judgments fail and mixed explanations begin to overlap. One long-running line of thought treats left-handedness as part of a broader human strategy of lateralization. The brain specializes, the body follows. Most individuals become right-handed because the system is biased strongly in that direction. But a strong bias is not the same as a rigid command. Variation remains possible, and once variation exists, selection does not necessarily crush it unless it imposes a heavy enough burden. In this view, left-handedness may be a minority outcome of a design that is useful overall, even if the minority outcome itself is not always advantageous. Human beings may benefit from being a lateralized species, and the persistent production of some left-handed individuals may simply be one tolerated consequence of that larger gain. This has a certain elegance, but it leaves important questions behind. If left-handedness were merely developmental overflow from a useful system, one might expect its frequency to drift more widely across time and place, or perhaps to fall lower if the cost was substantial, yet the trait appears to remain within a fairly narrow range. That suggests there may be more than passive tolerance at work. Perhaps left-handedness is not just something evolution allows, but something it quietly preserves. Here the idea of balancing selection enters the story. The phrase sounds technical, but the intuition is old and almost simple. A trait can survive in a population when opposing pressures keep it from either disappearing or taking over. A strategy may be beneficial only when uncommon. A feature may bring a small advantage in one domain and a small disadvantage in another. Under those conditions, evolution does not drive the population toward one universal form. It settles into a compromise. Left-handedness may be one such compromise, maintained not by constant superiority, but by a narrow balance between cost and benefit. The most famous version of this idea is sometimes called negative frequency-dependent selection. The principle is that a rare trait can gain value precisely because it is rare. Once it becomes common, that value fades. Imagine a population in which most social interactions, competitive habits, and embodied expectations are tuned to one dominant pattern. Anyone using the minority pattern may become harder to predict. Their movements are less familiar, their timing less anticipated, their angle of approach less practiced against. As long as they remain few, they retain the element of surprise. If they became many, the surprise would vanish. In that case, the minority is preserved by the very fact that it never becomes a majority. This is not a complete answer, but it is one of the strongest evolutionary ideas in the field. It has an appealing fit with human life because humans are intensely interactive animals. They compete, cooperate, fight, imitate, teach, and anticipate one another constantly. In such a species, an unusual motor pattern could matter more than it would in a solitary creature. The body is always meeting other bodies, and small differences in expectation can become meaningful. Scholars still debate the exact strength of this effect, and no single explanation fully accounts for the stable proportion of left-handers across all populations. But the logic is difficult to dismiss. Human beings do not evolve in isolation. They evolve in relation to each other. There are other evolutionary possibilities as well. Left-handedness may be linked, imperfectly and indirectly, to cognitive or neural diversity that benefits the group as a whole. This idea is harder to test and easier to romanticize, so it needs caution. The public loves claims that left-handers are inherently more creative, more innovative, more divergent in thought. The evidence for broad generalizations of that sort is far weaker than popular culture suggests. Still, it is possible that the developmental pathways associated with atypical lateralization help sustain a wider range of problem-solving styles or behavioral responses within populations. What survives in the record suggests diversity is often useful in social species, even when any one visible marker of that diversity does not map neatly onto a simple advantage. Another possibility is that left-handedness persists because it is genetically complex enough to resist easy elimination. Traits influenced by many genes, interacting with developmental conditions before and after birth, do not behave like single switches. Selection can shape tendencies, but it may not be able to remove all minority outcomes without changing the underlying system more drastically than evolution finds worthwhile. This would make left-handedness less a trait selected directly for its own sake, and more a recurrent byproduct of a flexible developmental architecture. That sounds modest, but even a byproduct can be evolutionarily meaningful if it survives, because the larger system producing it is valuable. The deeper one goes, the less likely it seems that one theory alone does all the work. More likely, several forces operate at once. Brain lateralization creates a strong species-wide bias toward right-handedness. Genetic and developmental complexity ensures that some individuals reliably diverge from that bias. The social and practical costs of being left-handed reduce any temptation to imagine it as universally beneficial. At the same time, rare advantages in direct competition or unpredictability may help offset those costs enough to keep the minority stable. Selection, in that sense, may not be choosing left-handedness so much as choosing a system in which a small left-handed minority remains worth having. There is something almost ecological about that arrangement. Human populations are not made up of identical bodies carrying identical strategies. They contain variation that can become useful under specific circumstances. One trait is common because it supports coordination and shared design. Another survives because uncommonness itself has situational value. The species becomes more like a landscape than a machine, with dominant features and persistent outliers occupying their own niches. Left-handedness, under this view, is not noise in the system, it is part of the texture of the system. That may explain why the trait often resists the language of defect. Defects tend to be either weeded out or strongly compensated for by modern support structures. Left-handedness is different. It is not rare enough, harmful enough, or random enough to fit that category well. Nor does it fit the opposite fantasy of hidden superiority. It behaves more like an old evolutionary compromise, one that societies have repeatedly misread because social prejudice prefers sharp categories. Civilization likes to divide bodies into normal and abnormal. Evolution is usually less interested in such clean distinctions. It is content with patterns that are messy, functional, and stable enough. A surprising detail here is how often human beings misunderstand stability. When a trait persists for a long time, people assume it must be beneficial in some obvious and dramatic way. But many stable traits survive because they are woven into systems of trade-off. They are not glorious solutions. They are workable arrangements. Left-handedness may belong in that class. It remains because the human species can afford it, because it may sometimes gain from it, and because removing it entirely would require reshaping deeper developmental patterns that already serve the species well. That is not a heroic explanation. It is, in a way, more interesting. The left hand survives because human evolution does not optimize toward uniformity. It settles for complex success. And once that possibility is admitted, the entire question changes shape. The persistence of left-handedness no longer looks like a failure of correction or an unresolved flaw in the species. It begins to look like evidence that human beings are built to contain a certain amount of asymmetrical variation. The right hand may dominate because that is how the broader system works best most of the time. The left hand may remain because best most of the time is not the same as best in every individual and every context. A species that lives by cooperation, improvisation, and constant interaction may do better with a little unpredictability left in reserve. So the clues hidden in evolution do not deliver one final answer, but they do narrow the possibilities. Left-handedness is too old and too stable to be dismissed as a mere accident. It is too costly in some domains to be treated as pure advantage. It is too persistent to be written off as error. Somewhere between developmental bias, genetic complexity, and the strange value of rarity, the left hand finds its place, not at the center of the human design, but inside it. Not as the rule, but as a minority outcome the rule seems unwilling to live without. The advantage of being left-handed, if there is one, does not announce itself in peaceful rooms. It appears where bodies must read and misread each other at speed. A blade flashes from an unfamiliar angle. A fist comes from the side most opponents train less often to defend. A wrestler sets a grip that feels subtly wrong. A tennis serve curves into habits built against the majority. A boxer circles the other way. Lead foot outside the expected line. Rhythm broken before the exchange has properly begun. Again and again, in contests where anticipation matters, the rare body seems to gain a small edge from being rare. This idea has a long appeal because it feels almost intuitive. In a population where most people are right-handed, daily experience trains everyone to expect right-handed action. They spar against right-handed partners, drill against right-handed attacks, imitate right-handed teachers, and unconsciously calibrate distance, timing, and threat around the majority pattern. The left-hander then arrives not with superhuman speed or strength, but with a geometry that is just unfamiliar enough to disrupt prediction, and in conflict, prediction is often the difference between control and panic. Modern sport offers some of the clearest examples. Left-handed athletes are often overrepresented in one-on-one or fast interaction sports such as boxing, fencing, baseball pitching and batting in specific situations, tennis, table tennis, cricket, and certain combat disciplines. The exact pattern varies by sport, by era, and by how handedness is measured. But the general tendency has been noticed often enough to attract serious attention. In these settings, Left-handedness may offer a strategic benefit precisely because opponents encounter it less frequently. Scholars still debate how large the advantage is and whether it persists equally at the highest levels. But the principle remains persuasive. Familiarity breeds preparedness. Rarity interrupts it. That same logic may extend backward into much older human environments. A hunter or fighter facing an uncommon stance may hesitate for a fraction of a second. A shield may be held the wrong way for the attack that follows. A strike may come across the body from an angle that training did not emphasize. In a close contest, tiny asymmetries matter. Humans do not fight as abstract organisms. They fight by reading posture, shoulder line, weight shift, reach, and rhythm. A minority body introduces noise into that reading. The left-hander's movements are not mysterious in themselves, but they are less rehearsed in the minds and muscles of others. This is the heart of the fighting hypothesis for left-handed persistence. If left-handed people enjoy an advantage in direct competition, especially male-male competition in ancestral settings involving status, territory, mates, or survival, then that advantage could help offset the social or practical disadvantages of being in the minority. The result would not need to be large. Evolution often works through small differences accumulated across many generations. A slight increase in success under certain conditions could be enough to help preserve the trait without allowing it to spread too far. In fact, the advantage would be strongest only while left-handedness remained rare. If too many individuals became left-handed, the population would adapt to that pattern too, and the edge would shrink. This is why the theory fits so neatly with frequency-dependent selection. The same rarity that makes left-handedness awkward in a right-handed world may also make it effective in right-handed conflict. The disadvantage and the advantage are tied together. A left-hander lives among tools, customs, and expectations built against them, but they may also benefit when direct interaction becomes competitive and prediction matters more than convenience. The world leans right in peace. The left hand becomes harder to read in struggle. There is some evidence from anthropology and biology that nudges this argument further. In certain studies, left-handedness has been associated with greater representation among elite fighters or higher success in direct competitive contexts. Some researchers have even explored whether left-handed men, in particular, may historically have gained reproductive advantages in environments where physical competition played a stronger role. The evidence remains incomplete, and these claims should be handled carefully. Human reproductive success is shaped by far more than fighting ability, and modern sports cannot be simply projected backward into prehistory. Still, the broader pattern has enough support to keep the hypothesis alive. No single explanation fully accounts for the persistence of left-handedness, but direct competition remains one of the strongest candidates for part of the answer. The hunting version of the argument is less certain but still suggestive. A left-handed hunter might handle weapons differently, stalk on different lines, or coordinate in complementary ways with right-handed companions. In some cases, unpredictability toward prey could matter, though animals do not study handedness the way human opponents do. More compelling is the possibility that hunting and fighting overlapped in the kinds of motor skills they rewarded: fast reaction, accurate throwing, asymmetrical body control, and the ability to exploit split-second openings. What survives in the record suggests early human life placed a premium on precisely these embodied skills. If left-handers gained even a modest edge in some of them, that edge might have mattered enough to preserve the minority over time. Yet caution is necessary. It is tempting to romanticize the left-hander as the natural duelist, the born trickster of the body, the one who survives by surprise. history rarely rewards such clean myths. Many left-handed individuals would have gained no particular advantage in fighting. Much would depend on training, environment, physique, and the specific kind of contest. In group warfare, standardization can matter more than individual oddness in daily life. The costs of using right-handed tools and fitting right-handed expectations remain real. The fighting hypothesis explains something, but probably not everything. It shines brightest in highly interactive, adversarial situations where the unfamiliar angle itself becomes a weapon. There is another subtlety here. The advantage of left-handedness may not lie only in physical mechanics, but in cognition under pressure. A person accustomed from childhood to adapting in a right-handed world may develop a habit of compensating, adjusting, or approaching tasks from unusual positions. That does not mean left-handers are automatically more inventive or tactically superior. Such sweeping claims go too far. But it is plausible that living as the minority body sharpens certain forms of embodied flexibility. The left-hander often has to learn the standard system while also quietly translating it. That double awareness could, in some contexts, become useful. Again, the evidence is limited, but the possibility fits the larger pattern of small situational benefits rather than dramatic universal gifts. Perhaps the strongest support for the theory is not any one data set, but the strange consistency of the underlying logic. Human beings are social animals whose bodies constantly predict one another. A rare motor strategy can therefore carry value that would not exist in a less interactive species. Most people train against the majority form. The minority gains surprise. Surprise fades if the minority grows too large. The numbers stabilize. It is one of those explanations that feels almost too elegant, which is why it must be treated with discipline. Elegant theories often seduce, but in this case, the elegance rests on a real feature of human life. We are creatures of repeated expectation, and rare bodies disturb that expectation. That disturbance may even help explain why left-handedness survives despite strong efforts to suppress it culturally. Schools can force writing. Custom can punish gesture. Tools can inconvenience the minority every day. But none of those pressures directly cancels the evolutionary value of rare unpredictability in competitive interaction. One side of human life pushes toward conformity. Another quietly preserves the advantage of deviation. The species lives between those two forces, and the result is not a world purified of left-handedness, but one that keeps producing it in modest, stable numbers. So the image of the left-hander in conflict is not just a curious sporting anecdote. It may be one of the oldest clues in the story. A body that is inconvenient at the desk may be advantageous in the duel. A hand that smears ink across a page may land where the opponent is slowest to expect it. A trait condemned in classrooms may once have helped secure survival, status, or mating opportunities in harsher settings where direct competition was impossible to avoid. Scholars still debate the scale of that effect, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the broader possibility is difficult to shake. The left hand may endure because, in the moments when human beings confront one another most directly, rarity itself can strike first. If the story ended with a hidden competitive advantage, it would be too clean. The left hand may surprise an opponent, but surprise is not the same as ease, and daily life is not a duel. Most human beings do not spend their lives in formal combat, and even those who do must still eat, write, work, build, carry, sew, cut, open, assemble, and move through environments shaped by the habits of others. Whatever small edge left-handedness may offer in rare contests, it comes paired with an unending tax paid to the ordinary world. That tax is part practical, part biological, part social, and part statistical confusion created by centuries of forcing people to perform against their own preferences. Untangling those threads is difficult. What remains clear is that being the exception has costs. Some of those costs are almost trivial when taken one by one. A pair of scissors drags instead of cutting cleanly. A can opener twists in the wrong direction. A desk in a lecture hall supports the wrong elbow. A chef's knife bevels oddly in the dominant grip. Power tools are safer when designed for the other hand. Card tables, camera controls, musical instruments, factory levers, spiral notebooks, gaming setups, measuring cups marked from the wrong side. All of them carry small assumptions about which hand leads and which follows. Each inconvenience is manageable. Together they create a steady current of adaptation. The left-handed person learns to rotate objects, reverse gestures, copy movements from right-handed instructors as mirror images, and perform tasks in ways that often look effortless, only because the effort has become constant. This quiet burden matters more than it first appears. Most right-handed people live inside tools and spaces that agree with them so completely they no longer notice the agreement. The handle sits where it should. The blade pulls the expected way. The lock turns with the natural wrist. The workspace assumes the dominant arm will not collide with the person beside them. For the left-hander, the world offers fewer such invisible collaborations. Everyday competence therefore depends more heavily on compensation. It is not that left-handed people cannot master right-handed systems. They clearly can, and often do. It is that mastery frequently requires translation, and translation consumes attention. In childhood, that extra attention can shape how ability is judged. A child who struggles with handwriting because the paper angle, hand position, and stroke direction are all unfavourable may be treated as clumsy rather than mismatched to the system. A student who takes longer to learn a tool demonstrated from the opposite side may appear slow rather than differently organised. In such cases, the cost of being left-handed is not simply ergonomic, it becomes social and educational. Performance is measured against standards built for the majority, and any friction is too easily mistaken for deficiency. There are also long-running claims about health and developmental differences associated with left-handedness. Some studies have reported links between left-handedness, or especially mixed-handedness, and slightly elevated rates of certain developmental disorders, injuries, immune conditions, learning difficulties, or mental health differences. Others have found little, inconsistent, or context-dependent effects. The literature is full of noise. Part of the problem is measurement. A person forced to switch hands in childhood may be recorded as right-handed in one study, left-handed in another, and mixed-handed in a third. Part of the problem is selection bias. Unusual findings are more likely to be published and repeated. Part of the problem is that atypical lateralization may overlap with many developmental pathways without meaning the same thing in every person. Scholars still debate how much of the statistical burden is real, how much is exaggerated, and how much reflects the long historical harm of retraining rather than handedness itself. Even so, it would be dishonest to pretend there are no biological costs at all. Human lateralization appears to be a finely tuned system, and minority outcomes within such systems may sometimes come with trade-offs. Atypical patterns of brain organization could, in some individuals, be linked to greater developmental variability. Variability is not automatically bad, but it does mean outcomes may be somewhat more scattered. Some left-handers thrive without any noticeable disadvantage beyond awkward tools. Others experience a more complicated profile of coordination, language, or learning. No single explanation fully accounts for this range. What survives in the record suggests caution above all else. Left-handedness is not a diagnosis. It is also not so neutral in every case that all differences can be dismissed as myth. Injury risk is another domain where the exception can pay a price. A tool designed with right-handed controls may expose the left hand more readily to the blade. A machine may eject material toward the wrong side. Safety instructions may be demonstrated from the majority perspective. Sports equipment may favor one stance, not only in performance but in protection. Roads, traffic patterns, weapon mechanisms, industrial workflows, and domestic appliances all embed directional assumptions that can matter under fatigue or speed. Most of the time, the left-handed user adapts. Occasionally, adaptation fails, and the cost becomes sharp. The body itself can also be caught between adaptation and strain. When a left-handed person learns tasks through right-handed technique, they may adopt compensatory postures that work but are not ideal. Wrists twist awkwardly while writing. Shoulders rotate differently under repetitive labor. Cutting, stitching, drilling, or playing an instrument with tools not designed for the dominant hand can create subtle inefficiencies that accumulate over time. Again, these are rarely catastrophic on their own, but history is made of repeated small frictions as much as grand catastrophes. The left-handed body often succeeds by negotiating with an environment that rarely begins by accommodating it. Then there is the cost of perception. The minority body is more likely to be noticed, commented on, remembered, corrected, joked about, or turned into a minor spectacle. In many modern settings, this may seem harmless, even friendly. A left-handed celebrity is mentioned as a curiosity. A child is asked to demonstrate how they hold the pencil. A colleague is teased over the awkward arrangement of place settings. But repeated attention can still have weight. It teaches a person that something ordinary in them will always arrive in public as a small exception requiring remark. The old stigma may have softened, yet the sense of being slightly out of place can survive long after open prejudice fades. And still, for all these costs, left-handedness does not behave like a trait under heavy enough pressure to disappear. That contradiction is what keeps the mystery alive. The disadvantages are real enough to matter. They are not real enough to erase the minority. Perhaps many of them are historically recent, amplified by literacy, industrial design, mass schooling, and standardized tools. Perhaps some are partly artifacts of research methods distorted by retraining and category problems. Perhaps others are genuine but modest, offset by advantages in other domains. Most likely all of these are true at once. The left hand pays for being the exception, but not so heavily that the species stops producing exceptions. There is a deeper lesson hiding in that balance. Human beings often imagine selection as ruthless efficiency, as though every costly feature should be polished away over time. But real populations do not function like perfect machines. They carry variation, compromise, redundancy, and mixed outcomes. A trait can survive while imposing mild burdens, especially if those burdens arise from social design rather than ancestral biology. Much of the hardship of left-handedness may come not from the trait itself, but from living in systems that convert majority convenience into universal expectation. In another kind of material culture, some of these costs would shrink immediately. That distinction matters because it pulls the story away from fatalism. The left-hander is not doomed by nature so much as inconvenienced by history. Yes, there may be modest biological trade-offs around a typical lateralization in some cases. Yes, the evidence remains incomplete and sometimes contradictory. but the most visible burdens of left-handed life have often been manufactured by environments that mistake common for correct. A right-handed world turns minority bodies into problems and then mistakes those problems for proof that the bodies were flawed to begin with. So the costs of being the exception are real, but they are revealing in the wrong way. They do not prove left-handedness is a mistake. They prove how thoroughly the majority can build itself into objects, rules, classrooms, and habits until deviation becomes labour. The left hand survives all the same, paying its steady toll in awkward grips, redesigned motions, subtle fatigue, and occasional injury, while reminding the species that even an old and stable minority still has to negotiate every day with a world that was never quite made for it. If handedness were simple inheritance, the mystery would have ended at the family table. A father writes with his left hand. A daughter does too. An uncle throws left-handed. A grandmother was forced to switch at school but still cuts bread with the left. Patterns like these are common enough to feel persuasive. Families notice them immediately. They become part of a household lore, folded into the same casual observations people make about height, temperament, eye shape, or the way certain expressions seem to reappear across generations. And yet handedness never behaves with the clean obedience of a trait governed by a single obvious rule. Two right-handed parents can have a left-handed child. Two left-handed parents often have right-handed children, identical twins, who share far more of their genetic material than ordinary siblings, can still differ in handedness. The family resemblance is real, the inheritance is real, but it is not simple. This has frustrated researchers for more than a century. The trait plainly runs in families often enough to imply a genetic contribution. A child with one or more left-handed relatives is, on average, more likely to be left-handed than a child with no such family pattern. That much is well supported, but the increase in likelihood is moderate, not decisive. Genes shape probability, not certainty. There is no single left-handed gene waiting neatly behind the curtain, ready to explain the persistence of the minority with one clean mechanism. Instead, handedness seems to emerge from a tangle of influences, many genes of small effect, developmental conditions before birth, early asymmetries in motor control, and the long, uneven process by which the brain and body settle into preference. Older theories often tried to impose order on this mess with simple dominant and recessive models. These were attractive because they felt familiar. If eye color or certain inherited conditions could be mapped through family lines, why not handedness? Some researchers proposed genes that pushed individuals toward right-handedness unless something disrupted the process. Others suggested a randomizing element, as though one genetic factor created bias while another allowed variation. These models captured part of the pattern, but never enough of it. Real families kept producing outcomes too messy for tidy rules. The evidence remains incomplete, but modern genetics has largely moved away from one-gene explanations toward a more complex picture. That complexity becomes especially clear in twin studies. Identical twins share nearly all their DNA, so if handedness was strongly determined by genes alone, one might expect them to match almost all the time. In reality, they often do match, but not always. Fraternal twins match less often, which supports a genetic role. Yet the mismatch among identical twins shows that genes cannot be the whole story. Something else is operating during development. Something capable of nudging one body left while the other settles right, even under strikingly similar genetic instructions. This is one of the most revealing features of handedness. It is inherited, but it is also improvised. The womb may be part of that improvisation, Prenatal development is not a perfectly symmetrical or perfectly stable process. Hormonal environments vary. Blood flow varies. Slight differences in fetal position and movement accumulate. The brain develops through countless timed events, any of which may introduce subtle asymmetries. Fetuses already show lateral preferences in movement and thumb sucking. Those early tendencies may help shape later-handedness, though not in a strict one-to-one way. Scholars still debate exactly how prenatal factors influence the outcome, and many proposed explanations have been oversimplified in public discussion. Still, what survives in the record suggests a trait taking shape before birth through a mixture of inherited bias and developmental contingency. This is why handedness resists the language of destiny. A genetic predisposition may tilt the odds, but it does not issue a command. The species as a whole appears biased toward right-handedness, perhaps because of the way lateralization supports brain efficiency and language organization. Individual development then unfolds within that bias. Most bodies follow the dominant path, some do not. Family history loads the dice, but it does not decide the throw. In a sense, every left-handed person stands at the meeting point between deep biological pattern and individual developmental variation. A lesser-known complication is that researchers are not always studying the same phenomenon when they say they are studying handedness, strong left-handedness, weak left preference, mixed-handedness, forced switching, and task-specific dominance may all be bundled together or separated differently from study to study. A person who writes with the right hand because they were retrained, but performs most other actions with the left, may be classified inconsistently. Someone who is broadly mixed-handed may carry a different developmental profile from someone who is strongly left-dominant across nearly every task. These distinctions matter because the genetics of a stable left preference may not be identical to the genetics of looser or more variable lateralization. Part of the reason the evidence looks contradictory is that the categories themselves are not always clean. Even so, the family pattern remains too persistent to dismiss. Handedness is not random in the everyday sense. Families often produce recognizable clusters, and those clusters tell us something important. The biological system that generates handedness is heritable enough to run through lineages, but flexible enough to preserve variation. That combination may be exactly what evolution requires. A rigidly inherited left-handed trait might either spread too widely or be selected against too sharply. A purely random trait might drift chaotically. Handedness does neither. It behaves like a biased developmental system that can be transmitted across generations without becoming predictable in any simple way. There is almost a quiet irony in that. Families are where older prejudices often tried hardest to intervene. Parents corrected children, grandparents warned them, teachers reported back. Yet families are also where the body keeps reappearing in its old form, as if inheritance refuses to be talked out of itself. A mother who was trained to write right-handed watches her son automatically reach left for a spoon. A grandfather who never used the left hand in public recognizes the same natural movement in a grandchild before anyone has named it. The household that once tried to suppress the pattern becomes the place where it reveals its continuity most plainly. This continuity does not prove handedness is genetically fixed in the strict sense. It proves something more subtle. Human beings inherit not only traits, but tendencies toward variation. The genetic contribution may not say be left-handed. It may say something more like develop within a system where lateralization can settle differently under certain conditions. That is harder to pin down, less satisfying for those who want simple answers. but closer to the truth of many human characteristics. Biology often creates ranges and biases rather than certainties. The twin evidence, the family clusters, and the persistent minority frequency all point in the same direction. Handedness is built into human development deeply enough to be inherited, but loosely enough to remain variable. That may be why it has endured so well. The species does not pass down left-handedness as a rare anomaly requiring perfect replication. It passes down a more general architecture of asymmetry, within which a stable minority of left-handed outcomes continues to arise. No single explanation fully accounts for every individual case, and the evidence remains incomplete on the precise pathways involved. But the pattern itself is clear enough. Left-handedness runs in families because asymmetrical brains run in families, and asymmetrical brains do not all resolve themselves in exactly the same way. So the family table turns out not to solve the mystery, but to deepen it. Inheritance is present, visible, undeniable, and yet never clean. The left hand arrives through bloodlines without obeying bloodlines completely. It appears often enough among relatives to prove continuity, and unpredictably enough among children and twins to prove contingency. That is not a failure of explanation. It is the explanation. Handedness belongs to that broad class of human traits shaped by both inheritance and development, by the script we receive and the improvisation through which the body learns to live it. The family carries the tendency. The individual body decides, or perhaps becomes, the outcome. The world of work reveals what theory often hides. A hand is never just a hand in the abstract. It appears inside a grip, against a surface, under weight, around a tool, across a page, along a string, against a shield strap, over a keyboard, beneath a chisel, and inside 1,000 learned motions that seem natural only because they have been repeated so often. This is where left-handedness becomes visible in its most practical form, not as a symbol and not as a statistical curiosity, but as a constant negotiation between the minority body and the majority design of labour. In craft traditions, technique is usually taught by demonstration. The master stands opposite or beside the learner and shows how the blade enters the wood, how the thread is drawn, how the reed pen is angled, how the hammer rotates in the wrist, how pressure is applied and released in small rhythms too subtle for language. For the right-handed apprentice, imitation flows almost directly from body to body. For the left-handed apprentice, every lesson arrives mirrored. The motion must be mentally reversed before it can be physically performed. This translation is so commonplace for left-handed people that it often goes unnoticed by everyone except the person doing it. Yet it is a real cognitive and bodily task. One learns not only the craft, but the inversion of the craft. That inversion has shaped countless forms of labour. The left-handed scribe, in cultures where writing runs from left to right, must cope with smudging, obscured letters, and awkward wrist posture. The left-handed carpenter encounters saws, planes, braces, and bench setups arranged according to right-handed assumptions. The left-handed tailor or embroiderer may find the rhythm of cutting and guiding cloth subtly off from the sequence demonstrated. The left-handed musician, especially in traditions where instruments are standardized, faces an old choice: reverse the instrument, adapt to the conventional orientation, or live somewhere between discomfort and innovation. None of these problems is impossible. That is almost the point. Left-handed people solve them so regularly that the world mistakes solvability for ease. Sometimes adaptation means adopting the right-handed method entirely. Many left-handed musicians, for example, learn on standard instruments because instruction, ensemble coordination, and instrument availability all favor conformity. They become highly skilled not by abolishing their natural preference, but by training around it until the conventional setup feels usable. In other cases, adaptation means reversing orientation. A left-handed guitarist may restring the instrument or play a mirrored instrument altogether. A left-handed archer may shoot from the opposite shoulder. A left-handed batter may stand on the other side of the plate and transform the geometry of the game. The choice between adapting and reversing is rarely just technical. It reflects availability, tradition, cost, pedagogy, and how tolerant a field is of bodies that do not match the original template. Writing may be the clearest long historical example because it sits at the crossing point of body, technology, and public judgment. A left-handed person can write beautifully, of course, but writing systems have never been neutral toward the hand. Direction matters, ink matters, pen shape matters, paper position matters. In some historical contexts, certain scripts may have been more forgiving to the left hand than others. In others, the physical act of writing turned left-handedness into a visible inconvenience that invited correction. The page became an instrument of bodily discipline. The script was not only a way of storing language, but a mechanism for sorting acceptable movement from awkward deviation. And yet work has also given the left-hand moments of advantage and distinctiveness. In combat arts, fencing, boxing, and many sports, the unusual angle of a left-handed stance has long been recognized as disruptive. In some manual tasks, working opposite to the majority can create spatial complementarity, allowing two people side by side to interfere less with each other. In certain artistic practices, unusual hand dominance may encourage altered posture, line, or rhythm. Not because left-handers possess some mystical creativity, but because they are forced into different routes through the same material problems. The evidence remains incomplete, and sweeping claims about inherent artistic superiority should be resisted. Still, what survives in the record suggests that adaptation itself can become a source of distinctive technique. Art is especially revealing because it exposes the limits of standardization. A workshop can insist on method, but the hand eventually leaves its own trace. Brush pressure varies, tool approach varies. A line thickens in one direction and thins in another. The body's preference enters the object even when the training tried to suppress it. Scholars have sometimes attempted to infer handedness from surviving artworks, inscriptions, or craft marks, though such efforts must remain cautious because style, training, and material conditions complicate the picture. But the underlying intuition is sound. Labor records the body. The hand is never fully invisible in what it makes. Warfare, too, has always been a theatre of bodily expectation. In close combat systems, formations, shield use, weapon draw, and tactical drill often assume a dominant side. This can make left-handedness disruptive in group order, while simultaneously making it dangerous in individual encounters. A left-handed swordsman may be awkward in a line built for standardized movement, yet unusually difficult in a duel. A left-handed soldier may have to conform in drill while privately knowing that instinct takes over differently when danger becomes immediate. Once again, the trait lives between cost and advantage, standardization and surprise. Modern office work may seem far removed from these older histories, but it preserves the same structure in miniature. The computer mouse sits on the right. The number pad assumes the right hand will travel outward. Desks, lecture seats, scissors in supply drawers, camera shutters, industrial interfaces, touch gestures, even the direction of notebook spirals and binder rings, all carry forward the long silent confidence of majority design. Most of these obstacles are mild. Some are easily solved with better design, yet their sheer number reveals something important. The right-handed world is not just a collection of biased tools. It is a history of repeated assumptions materialized into everyday objects. This is why left-handed work so often produces quiet ingenuity. The left-hander becomes a translator of environments. Instructions are mentally flipped. Techniques are mirrored. Movements are resequenced. Tools are regripped, reversed, or repurposed. None of this needs to be dramatic to matter. Over years, it produces a kind of embodied adaptability that is rarely celebrated because it is treated as ordinary coping. But coping itself is a skill, especially when it must be performed daily and invisibly. There is also a social layer to all this. Skilled work often carries traditions of legitimacy. There is a right way to hold, a proper way to strike, a standard way to sit, a correct way to place the fingers. These norms are often presented as purely functional, and sometimes they are. But because they emerge from majority bodies, they can also smuggle handed assumptions into the definition of competence. A left-handed learner may be corrected not because the result is worse, but because the motion looks wrong to the instructor. In that moment, craft becomes another archive of cultural pressure. The body is being judged not only for what it produces, but for whether it resembles the usual body while producing it. No single explanation fully accounts for the role of left-handedness in work and art, because each domain imposes different demands. Some punish deviation harshly, some reward it, some barely notice, but across them all, one pattern repeats. The left-handed person enters systems built by right-handed majorities and must either conform, modify, or invent. Out of that pressure comes strain. Yes, but also technique. The unusual body becomes practiced in adjustment. Sometimes that adjustment remains invisible. Sometimes it changes the field itself. And that may be one of the most overlooked facts in the whole history of handedness. Left-handed people do not merely survive in right-handed systems. They alter those systems at the edges. A reversed instrument becomes accepted. A different stance becomes strategically valued. A teaching method becomes more flexible because the old one excluded too many capable learners. A tool is redesigned. A workspace becomes less rigid. Change rarely begins as generosity. More often it begins because the minority body keeps showing, again and again, that the standard body was never universal after all. So the left hand in work and art tells a double story. It tells of friction, misfit, and the exhausting labour of adaptation. But it also tells of persistence so skillful that it eventually leaves marks on the very traditions that once excluded it. The minority hand does not merely endure the world's design. It sometimes bends that design, quietly and without permission, until what once seemed abnormal becomes just another way a human body can learn to do beautiful, dangerous, delicate, or necessary things. By the time modern science begins to take handedness seriously, much of the old suspicion has already begun to loosen, but it has not disappeared. It lingers in habits, in language, in design, and in the quiet expectations people carry without noticing. What changes is not the presence of the left hand, but the way it is explained. Where earlier cultures reached for symbolism, modern inquiry turns to measurement, experiment, imaging, and statistical patterns. The mystery is no longer moral. It becomes biological, cognitive, developmental, and yet, even under this new lens, the answers remain incomplete. Early scientific approaches to handedness often inherited the same desire for simplicity that shaped older beliefs. Researchers looked for single causes, clear divisions, universal rules. The brain was mapped into neat halves. The left hemisphere was labeled logical, the right creative. Right-handedness became the norm tied to proper brain organization. Left-handedness was sometimes treated as a deviation, occasionally even as a defect. These interpretations carried the authority of science, but many of them oversimplified what the evidence actually showed. Over time, as methods improved and data accumulated, the tidy picture began to unravel. Modern neuroscience reveals a far more complex landscape. Brain imaging shows that lateralization exists, but it is not absolute. Language, for example, is often concentrated in the left hemisphere for right-handed individuals, but many left-handed individuals also show left hemisphere dominance, while others display more distributed or even right-sided patterns. Motor control, sensory integration, and higher cognitive functions overlap in ways that resist strict separation. The brain is not divided into two clean personalities. It is a network of regions that cooperate, specialize, and compensate. Handedness reflects this system, but does not define it. This shift matters because it removes the idea that left-handedness is simply a mirror reversal of right-handedness. A left-handed person is not just a flipped version of a right-handed one. The internal organization can vary widely. Some left-handers resemble right-handers in brain structure more than they resemble each other. Others show more mixed or bilateral patterns. Scholars still debate how these differences arise and what they mean. The evidence remains incomplete, but one conclusion has become increasingly clear. Handedness is not a simple binary rooted in a single brain difference. It is one visible expression of a deeply variable system. Psychology adds another layer. Researchers have long been fascinated by the possibility that handedness might correlate with personality traits, intelligence, creativity, or mental health. Popular culture amplifies these ideas, often turning them into bold claims about left-handers being more artistic, more intuitive, or more prone to certain disorders. The reality is quieter. Large-scale studies tend to show small effects at most, often inconsistent and sensitive to how handedness is defined. Some correlations exist, but they rarely justify sweeping generalizations. What survives in the record suggests variation within groups is far greater than differences between them. Even so, modern science has not entirely escaped older biases. For a long time, left-handed individuals were underrepresented in research samples, especially in studies of brain function. Scientists sometimes excluded them to avoid complicating results, which had the unintended effect of reinforcing the idea that right-handedness was the natural baseline. Only gradually did the field begin to recognize that excluding the minority meant missing an important part of human variation. Today, there is greater effort to include left-handers in research, but the legacy of earlier assumptions still shapes some interpretations. Education has undergone a similar shift. The harsh correction methods of the past have largely been abandoned in many parts of the world. Teachers are now more likely to accommodate left-handed students, adjusting seating, tools, and instruction rather than forcing conformity. Writing techniques have evolved to reduce strain. Specialized equipment is more widely available. The change is not universal, and subtle biases still persist, but the overall direction is clear. The left hand is no longer treated as something to be fixed. It is treated as something to be understood. Yet even in this more tolerant environment, the traces of older thinking remain. A left-handed child may still be singled out for curiosity. A classroom may still be arranged in ways that favor the majority without realizing it. A design decision may still assume right-handed use as the default. These are not acts of hostility. They are habits inherited from a long history in which the majority defined normal without needing to justify it. Changing such habits takes time, not only in policy but in perception. One of the most interesting developments in recent decades is the growing recognition that variability itself may be a strength of human populations. Instead of asking why left-handedness exists as an anomaly, some researchers now ask what role variation in lateralization plays in the broader adaptability of the species. Different brain organizations may support different ways of processing information, solving problems, or responding to complex environments. This does not mean left-handers are inherently superior or fundamentally different in any simple way. It means that diversity in how brains are organized could contribute to the resilience of human groups. At the same time, science continues to wrestle with the limits of its own explanations. Genetic studies have identified regions of the genome associated with handedness, but none provide a complete account. Developmental studies reveal early asymmetries, but not a single decisive moment where handedness is fixed. Evolutionary theories offer plausible mechanisms, but no definitive proof. Each layer of investigation adds detail while leaving the central mystery intact. Why does the human species maintain this particular balance of right and left? Why this proportion, this persistence, this pattern across cultures and centuries? Perhaps the most honest answer modern science can offer is that handedness is not a problem waiting to be solved, but a feature of human biology that reflects deeper principles of variation and organization. It shows how a species can be strongly biased without being uniform. It shows how development can produce consistent patterns without rigid determinism. It shows how culture can amplify, distort, or soften biological differences without erasing them. And it shows how even in an age of advanced measurement, some questions remain open not because they are unimportant, but because they are woven into the complexity of life itself. The old suspicion has faded, but the mystery remains. The left hand is no longer a sign of misfortune or moral error. It is a clue, a small but persistent signal that the human body does not divide itself evenly, and that this unevenness has been carried forward not as a flaw, but as part of the design. Modern science does not close the case, it deepens it, replacing simple answers with richer, more careful questions that reach from the smallest movements of the hand to the broadest patterns of human evolution. When the story pulls back from brains, bones, tools, and traditions, something quieter comes into view. Handedness is no longer just about which hand holds the knife or writes the line. It becomes a small window into how human beings live with difference at all. A species that depends on cooperation faces a constant tension. It must be similar enough to function together, to share tools, language, systems, and expectations. But it must also be varied enough to adapt, to solve new problems, to survive changing environments, and to avoid becoming fragile through uniformity. Handedness sits precisely in that tension. It shows how a population can lean strongly in one direction while still maintaining a minority that does not follow the same pattern. Most of the time, that minority is easy to overlook. The right-handed majority moves through the world without noticing how thoroughly it has shaped that world. The left-handed minority learns to adapt so quietly that adaptation becomes invisible. But when the difference is noticed, it often reveals something deeper than inconvenience. It reveals how quickly human systems turn majority habits into universal rules, and how slowly those rules are questioned. This pattern repeats far beyond handedness. Languages favor certain sounds and structures, making others feel strange or incorrect. Social norms define proper behavior based on what most people already do. Institutions standardize bodies, movements, and expectations to simplify teaching and coordination. In each case, the majority creates a framework that feels natural, even inevitable. The minority then appears as a deviation, not because it is inherently flawed, but because the system was not built with it in mind. Handedness makes this process unusually visible because it is so simple and so physical. There are only two hands. The difference is easy to see. The consequences are immediate. A tool either fits or it does not. A gesture either aligns with expectation or it does not. There is no abstract argument to hide behind. The body itself becomes the evidence. And yet, despite this clarity, the interpretation has shifted again and again across history. What begins as a neutral variation becomes a symbol. The symbol becomes a stigma. The stigma becomes a target for correction. Correction becomes habit. Habit becomes design. Design becomes invisible. And then, slowly, the process reverses. The stigma weakens. The correction fades. The design begins to adapt. The variation returns to something closer to what it was at the beginning. A difference that exists without needing to justify itself. This cycle reveals something fundamental about human societies. They're not static. They build systems that favor certain forms, then gradually reshape those systems when the cost of exclusion becomes too visible. Left-handedness has moved through this cycle more than once. It has been ignored, noticed, judged, corrected, and gradually re-accepted. Each stage leaves traces behind, in language, in tools, in memory, in the quiet habits people carry without realizing where they came from. There is also a more subtle lesson in how the minority experiences the world. To be left-handed in a right-handed environment is to live with a constant low-level awareness that things could be arranged differently. Every object that must be turned, every movement that must be mirrored, every instruction that must be mentally flipped, reinforces the idea that the standard way is not the only way. This does not automatically produce insight or creativity, but it does create familiarity with alternatives. The left-handed person learns, often without thinking about it, that systems are built, not given. That awareness can extend beyond the hand itself. It can shape how a person approaches problems, how they interpret rules, how they respond to situations where the expected solution does not quite fit. Again, this should not be exaggerated into claims of inherent superiority. Most left-handed people simply adapt and move on, but the experience of being the exception, even in small ways, can leave a lasting imprint on how one sees structure and possibility. At the same time, the majority also learns, though more slowly. As tools and environments become more inclusive, right-handed people begin to notice the assumptions that once went unquestioned. A redesigned workspace, a mirrored instrument, a more flexible teaching method. These changes do not only benefit the minority, they reveal that the old design was never as universal as it seemed. Inclusion becomes a form of correction, not of the body, but of the system. Modern design has started to reflect this shift. Many tools are now created with ambidextrous use in mind. Interfaces allow for customization. Educational practices are more adaptable. These changes are uneven and incomplete, but they mark a significant departure from the past. Instead of forcing the minority to conform entirely to the majority, the environment itself begins to adjust. The cost of difference is reduced not by eliminating the difference, but by widening the space in which it can function. This does not erase the asymmetry at the heart of the story. The world is still largely right-handed. It always will be, as long as the underlying biological pattern remains. But the meaning of that asymmetry can change. It can move from hierarchy to preference, from judgment to accommodation. The left hand does not need to become common to become accepted. It only needs to be recognized as part of the same system that produces the majority. In that sense, handedness becomes a small model of a much larger principle. Human beings are not built to be identical. They are built to share patterns while allowing variation within those patterns. When societies forget this, they tend to mistake the common for the correct and the rare for the wrong. When they remember it, they begin to design systems that can hold both without conflict. The left hand has survived long enough to witness both tendencies. It has been pushed aside and pulled back in. It has been corrected and then accommodated. It has been misunderstood and then studied. Through all of this, it has remained what it always was, a natural variation within a species that leans strongly in one direction, but never entirely abandons the other. And perhaps that is the quietest answer the story offers. Left-handedness persists not because it must justify itself, but because human beings are the kind of creatures who do not resolve all their asymmetries into uniformity. They carry them forward instead, building worlds that reflect their biases while slowly learning to make room for what those worlds leave out. In the end, the survival of the left hand says less about error than about tolerance. Not tolerance in the moral sense alone, though that matters, and history has often lacked it. Something deeper than that. A biological tolerance, an evolutionary tolerance, a structural tolerance built into the species itself. Human beings are not organized with perfect rigidity. They are organized with a strong bias. Yes, a clear and ancient tilt toward the right, but also with enough looseness in the system for a minority path to remain open. That minority path has never been comfortable. It has often been mistrusted, corrected, burdened with symbolism, and turned into inconvenience by the material habits of the majority. Yet it has never closed. This is what makes the story larger than handedness. The left hand survives because human life is not engineered toward total uniformity. It cannot be. A species built for language, cooperation, tool use, migration, invention, and adaptation gains strength from broad regularity, but it also gains resilience from preserving some room for deviation. Most people must be similar enough to share methods, tools, and expectations. Not everyone must be the same. In fact, the long record suggests the species never fully tries to make that happen, even when cultures imagine they do. That helps explain why the right-handed world has always been both powerful and incomplete. The majority hand shapes tools, scripts, rituals, classrooms, military drill, craft instruction, domestic routines, and the unconscious geometry of public life. It leaves such a deep imprint on the built environment that right-handedness begins to feel invisible, like gravity or weather, less a preference than a fact of existence. But invisibility is one of the privileges of being common. The right-handed world seems natural not because it is universal, but because it has had the numbers to build itself into wood, iron, paper, law, furniture, and habit. The left hand exposes that construction simply by colliding with it. And still, after all the collisions, the minority remains. That persistence strips older prejudices of their authority. A trait does not endure across prehistory, civilization, industrialization, mass schooling, scientific scrutiny, and modern redesign if it is merely a mistake the species forgot to correct. The body keeps making left-handed people because left-handedness belongs, however uneasily, to the range of outcomes human development is built to allow. It is not outside the system. It is part of the system's permitted variation. This is where the story circles back to its earliest clue. Before civilization named the difference, the body was already choosing sides. Before temples, schools, ink, formal etiquette, and symbolic suspicion, asymmetry was already there in movement, in grip, in cut marks and wear patterns, in the awkwardly intimate evidence of teeth and bone. That ancientness matters. It means the argument against the left hand has always come too late. Culture arrives after the trait. Judgment arrives after the body. Correction arrives after the nervous system has already begun to settle into one of the paths available to it. What changes through history is not the existence of the trait, but the degree of friction imposed on it. Some worlds make left-handedness harder than others. A foraging band may barely care. A script-heavy bureaucracy may care a great deal. An industrial tool system may convert smaller symmetries into repeated inconvenience. A modern inclusive design philosophy may reduce that burden again. The meaning of left-handedness therefore shifts with the structure of society. Even while the underlying minority persists, this is an important distinction. Much of what left-handed people have suffered has not come from the hand itself, but from systems built too narrowly around the majority. That narrowness reveals a wider human pattern. Societies often confuse prevalence with correctness. Because most people move one way, that way becomes proper. Because most tools fit one grip, that grip becomes standard. Because most gestures emerge from one side, that side becomes respectable. Then, when the minority body struggles, the system reads the struggle as proof that the minority was flawed from the start. History is full of this mistake. Handedness is simply one of its clearest and most intimate examples. But handedness also reveals something hopeful. Systems can change. The old stigma can weaken. Classrooms can stop punishing. Tools can be redesigned. Instructors can teach more flexibly. The right-handed world does not have to stop being right-handed in order to become less hostile to those who are not. That is perhaps the most practical lesson in the entire story. Human variation does not always need to be cured, corrected, or explained away. Sometimes it needs room. And room, once granted, changes the meaning of the trait. The left hand no longer appears as a defect struggling against fate. It appears as what it has likely always been, a minority form of being human, preserved through a combination of developmental complexity, evolutionary balance, and the stubborn refusal of life to become perfectly standardized. The right hand remains the rule. The left hand remains the exception, but the exception is not outside history. It is woven through history at every level, from prehistoric campsites to school desks, from cave walls to brain scans, from superstition to sports, from correction to accommodation. Scholars still debate the final proportions of the answer. They debate genes, prenatal factors, lateralization, evolutionary trade-offs, competitive advantage, developmental variability. The evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for why the species settles at this particular asymmetry and not another. But perhaps the deepest answer is not numerical at all. Perhaps the persistence of left-handedness tells us that human beings survive not by eliminating every deviation from the dominant pattern, but by carrying some of those deviations forward, allowing them to remain even when they complicate design, habit, and expectation. A right-handed world, then, is not a world that defeated the left hand. It is a world that never entirely could. The majority built the furniture, the ritual, the script, the tool rack, the drill yard, the classroom. The minority kept arriving anyway, generation after generation, reaching first with the same old unfavored hand. Sometimes it was corrected, sometimes mocked, sometimes accommodated, sometimes admired in rare moments of contest where unfamiliarity became an edge, but it was never erased. And that may be the lingering image the story leaves behind. Not a grand battle between two equal halves of humanity, but a long, uneven coexistence. One side builds the world, the other learns to live in it, reshape it, and quietly remind everyone that the world was built from preference, not destiny. The left hand still exists in a right-handed world because human beings, for all their love of order, have never been creatures of pure uniformity. They remain biased, asymmetrical, and variable, carrying their differences forward through time like small, stubborn proofs that survival does not always belong to the majority alone. The hand reaches out again at the end of the story, as it did at the beginning, quietly choosing before the world has time to explain itself. Across caves and classrooms, temples and workshops, battlefields and writing desks, that small choice has endured. Most people lean one way, some lean the other, and from that slight unevenness, entire histories of meaning have been built. It is strange, perhaps, that something so ordinary should carry so much with it. A hand on a page, a hand on a tool, a hand raised in greeting, lifted in defence, resting on a table in the dim light of evening. Yet history is often like that. It gathers around the smallest recurring facts of the body and turns them into systems, symbols, rules, and suspicions. Then time passes, and the body remains after the explanations have changed. The left hand has survived old superstition, though not without scars. It has survived correction, though not without strain. It has survived the long confidence of a world arranged for others first, not by triumph, and not by becoming common, but by continuing. Quietly, repeatedly, in each generation, it appears again, as if the species is reminding itself that even its strongest patterns are never absolute. Perhaps that is why the subject feels larger the longer one sits with it. This is not only a story about handedness, it is a story about how human beings live inside a symmetry, how they build worlds from the comfort of the majority, how they mistake familiarity for correctness, and, sometimes, how they slowly learn to soften those mistakes and make room for what was always there, somewhere tonight, or this morning, or in some room not yet built when the first handprints dried on cave walls. A child will reach first with the left hand. No ceremony will announce it. No ancient omen will descend. It will just happen in the old, unplanned way. A spoon taken from the wrong side. A crayon lifted in the unexpected grip. A small motion carrying behind it tens of thousands of years of continuity. And that may be the calmest way to leave the mystery, not as a problem solved once and for all, but as a reminder that human history is never perfectly straight, never perfectly symmetrical, never fully obedient to its own rules. One side may dominate, the other remains, and in that quiet imbalance, something essential about the species endures not sameness, but persistence with indifference, carried forward by the simplest act of all, a hand reaching into the world as naturally as breath.